Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, we will be looking at Heraclitus by Philip Wheelwright. As you can probably imagine, it's just a book about the early philosopher Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, the pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosopher. If you've been listening to the previous episodes lately, you know I've been touching on some of these early Greek philosophers, seeing if we can get any insight about maybe what philosophy is, and also to see if we can get some insight about whether or not the ancient Greek thinkers have anything to say to us today that we can maybe incorporate into our own society to help us deal with some of the problems that we're facing. It might seem like a stretch to try to be looking back to these ancient Greek philosophers, but I do think that there's a lot that we can learn here from them. Heraclitus is not like a political philosopher in the sense that both Plato and Aristotle talk about politics a fair amount. Heraclitus does not. But it's really pretty interesting. We've looked at a few books. Let me just mention, this book originally was written 1959, and the one I'm reading right now is a reprint or a special edition published 1999. So that's a good mid 20th century analysis. So anyway, in a few of the previous books we've looked at, in particular, when I first started talking about the pre-Socratics was with Nietzsche, and we looked in particular at Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. Touched on Anaximander a little bit in the last episode when we were looking at Martin Heidegger. Talked a little bit about Anaximander, and this one we're going to jump forward to Heraclitus, and then in the next episode I'll talk a little more about Parmenides. So I want to take these three philosophers that we looked at in Nietzsche and examine them in a little more detail. So here we're hitting on Heraclitus, and Heraclitus and Parmenides kind of stand as sort of opposite poles, the way that Nietzsche understood them and the way that I've kind of been presenting them and understanding them. It's simplistic to simply say that they really represent like opposing poles, that Parmenides is, a complete and absolute monist, believing in only one thing, and Heraclitus is this advocate of pluralism and only believing in many things and constant strife and change. And it's easy to exaggerate those positions and set them at like the absolute poles of monism and pluralism. But I think the reality is a little bit more complicated than that, and in some of the readings from this book, that's going to come out. Like all of my episodes, I'll be digging into some longer sections of the book. I don't have that many sections. I think this book I have only 4 different parts that I want to read. 4. I have 4. And so let me just jump right in here and start reading from this first section when he's talking about Heraclitus's views of perpetual change. Heraclitus being the one who had come up with the idea of, you can't step in the same river twice because everything is constantly changing. The river you stepped in is no longer the same river. You're not the same person the second time around quite as you were the first time around. So while you've changed, the river's changed, everything has changed from last moment to this moment and is perpetually changing. And even things that change very slowly are still changing. So, Philip Wheelwright, I believe Professor Wheelwright, I'm pretty sure Wheelwright is a professor. Yeah, professor at the University of California. So let me jump in here, start reading a little bit about what he has to say about Heraclitus and perpetual change, and then we'll see, what we have to say about that. So Wheelwright says, quote, "The theme of unceasing change is a very old one in philosophy. In every experience and in our normal ways of responding to that experience, it would seem that the proposition, 'everything changes,' represents only a half-truth, although a very important one, for along with its multifariously shifting, fading, and vanishing aspects, the world also shows some indications of the stable and permanent. Men may come and men may go, but the truth of the multiplication table does not budge. Or if that example is rejected as a mere conceptual abstraction, one can point to certain more substantial fixities within the physical environment itself. Although the houses may all go under the hill, Mother Earth remains solidly herself. Although individuals and societies sprout and fall like leaves, the human race somehow goes on. Or even as a precarious corollary of the thermonuclear age, if we should at last succeed in blowing up the Earth and exterminating mankind, presumably the stars would continue in their orbits, majestically unmoved by our mundane fidgetings. What experience and imagination jointly offer to our view, it would seem, is the changing and the permanent in varying combinations. The philosophy of change, as represented by Heraclitus, goes a step further, however. Permanence is but a relative term, his philosophy declares, and what we call permanent is simply an example of change in slow motion or in hidden guise. All structures, if you observe them patiently enough and project your imagination far enough, are dissolving slowly. Everything, as the Greeks put it, is in the process of coming to be and passing away. Obviously, when Heraclitus says that everything flows and gives way, he does not mean that everything does so at the same rate or with the same degree of outward apparency. To our daily life of sensation and impulse, it makes a great deal of difference whether something lasts 5 seconds or 5 weeks or 5 billion years, but such differences do not affect the underlying principle that sooner or later each thing must come to an end. The time spans of a lightning flash or a human career and of the course of evolution from protozoan to man are all finite time spans, despite their obviously different lengths. That is the self-evident truth on which the philosophy of change hinges. Moreover, even in what appears to be most solid and perduring, there is some change going on all the while. Even where no evidence of change is visible to the eye, the presumption is that everything is undergoing some secret alteration in one way or another at every moment. To Heraclitus's concretely philosophical imagination, this universal condition is symbolically represented by the flowing river, in which you cannot step twice, and by fire, the most volatile of all physical things. When Heraclitus says that everything is undergoing some degree of alteration at every moment, he must be understood in his own context, and not in ours. A literate person today would readily admit, if he stopped to think about the matter, that the apparently solid and inert table on which he rests his elbow is really a collection of rapidly moving molecules, and that the visible color of the table is really a mental and subjective impression brought about by vibrations of certain frequency striking the optical nerves. Heraclitus knew nothing about all this, and hence he certainly could not be referring to it. In saying that everything is constantly changing, what he refers to is a phenomena much closer to actual experience than the scientific doctrine of molecular movement is for most of us. The meaning can be discovered by a simple test. Try staring at some colorful object long enough, and if your perceptual memory is keen, you will find that some change has come into the visible quality during the long process of staring at it. The blue of the sky is likely to become a somewhat duller blue after too prolonged a gazing. Similarly, with the kinds of qualities presented by hearing, taste, and touch. To such observations, the modern reply is likely to be that what has changed is not the thing itself, but merely our perception of it. But it must be remembered that this psychophysical dualism, for which the past 3 centuries or so has been an idea fix for most of us, was not a natural and required starting point for thinking in Heraclitus' day. For him, as for most Greek thinkers, qualities are in the main what they appear to be. They are properties of things primarily, of minds secondarily. And the distinction between the thing beheld and the mind beholding it was loose and fluctuating. Heraclitus was one who looked at the world with the eye of a painter or of a child, and his powerful speculations about the nature of things were reared upon that basis. In the qualitative sense, all things are constantly changing because the qualities themselves are wavering. And for Heraclitus, a thing is nothing more than the complete set of all the qualities and powers that belong to and constitute it. End quote. Okay, so what can we see out of that? Well, we see that a couple things. That he starts off saying, well, if you look around, it kind of seems like the world is a mix of things that are changing and things that are staying the same. And Heraclitus takes that and says, well, actually, the things that are staying the same are actually just changing very slowly. And so he also says, like, toward the end, that a thing is basically nothing but the collection of qualities. He says, for Heraclitus, a thing is nothing more than the complete set of all the qualities and powers that belong to and constitute it. So sort of like when everything is just an accumulation of the various qualities of it, when you strip, like I had talked in previous episodes about stripping away all the qualities, and there's just this thing left over which bears the qualities. Heraclitus isn't really on that. He's more like, if you really truly take away all of the qualities, there is nothing left. There is no thing left. The thingness itself is in a way a quality. It exists today, and it may not exist tomorrow, or he just sees everything as just a giant jumble of conflicting qualities with no real permanent substance underlying it. But he also talks a little bit about, like, in the modern world would say, oh, well, the table is really made out of molecules, and the molecules are all moving around, and so it might look like the table is just sitting there not doing anything, but in reality we know that it's actually comprised of a bunch of atoms and electrons, and all the electrons are spinning, and the atoms might be, they might have some kind of vibration or kinetic motion going on. I'm not a physicist, so I don't know what degree of motion an atom would have inside of a table, but regardless, and he talks about, like, if you were to stare at something for a long time, and it kind of looks different after a while, and I think he might go a little bit too far with this. I don't think that the ancient Greek, would look at something and say, like, if you stare at something too long, your eyes start making like dots, or the vision of it gets kind of burned into your eyeball, and so there's like sort of color shifting that goes on as your eyes are like almost revolting, like, hey, look at something else. This is and that the Greek would think that was an actual change in the quality of the thing, because they didn't recognize the separation of observation of the qualities observed and the qualities possessed. I'm not so sure if the Greek would actually think that staring at the sky long enough changed the color of the sky. I don't know, as though, that sort of depends on, like, the ancient Greeks saying, well, if I close my eyes, then everything disappears, like a child, like an infant. I don't think that's the case. I think they probably understood that, like, sometimes there are things such as illusions where your perception of something is not entirely accurate. And so there must be a distinction between the perception of a thing and its actual qualities in order for the idea of illusion to even mean anything. So I think he might go a little too far in that regard, but the point really is that Heraclitus is really saying that everything is changing, even the things that seem like they're not changing, they actually are. And everywhere you look, there's constant time is passing, right? And in order for time to pass, something goes, from the state it was to the state it becomes. And even to the sense that it doesn't change, it's kind of still two different things, because, like this, there's the table yesterday, and then there's the table today, and the table yesterday is not the same as the table today, regardless of how much its qualities have changed, because it's older. The simple quality of the age. How old is the table? Well, the table's 1 day older. And so by that fact alone, it has changed in its quality of age. So the very passage of time is forcing change upon the world perpetually. All right, so let me move on to another section shortly after that one. When he starts talking about strife as king. So in this book, and in a lot of the other book by Martin Heidegger, and some of the other stuff that I will be reading in the future, he writes out the various fragments of Heraclitus. I'm not going to read the fragments of Heraclitus unless it's mentioned in the text. Because it's a little bit, some of it's a little bit like challenging, and it's not really connected all that well. It's not like a book. It's just a collection of fragments. Like all these pre-Socratics are really just collections of fragments. We don't have their whole writing. And so it doesn't really flow that well to just read the fragments. So I'm only going to actually read the actual fragments if it's mentioned in the text. Otherwise, I'm just going to read the basic bird's eye view of what it is that Heraclitus is talking about. So anyway, so in this quote, he's talking about the concept of strife and conflict as like the basis of reality. So here he says, quote, "Even if we are concerned with change in its directly perceived character, which is to say as an alteration of quality, not as a conceptualized movement of molecules, it is still an odd thing for us and a violation of our linguistic and intellectual habits to speak of the warm becoming cool, the moist becoming dry, and so on. We can see what the trouble is by a very simple mental and linguistic experiment. Instead of saying the warm becomes cool, or the warm becomes the cool, let us try the experiment of saying what was warm becomes cool. Presto, the oddity and the sense of paradox have disappeared. We are no longer burdened with the troublesome idea of something turning into its own opposite. We have substituted for that paradox the more manageable idea of an unspecified something, a what, which can successively wear the attributes of warm and cold, in somewhat the same way in which a person might successively wear different suits of clothes. In forming a conception of change, we find ourselves constrained to think, as Aristotle has demonstrated, not dyadically in terms of two opposites alone, but triadically in terms of the pair of opposites, and a substance or stratum or subject or thing in which the opposites are conceived successively to inhere. It is hard to conceive, Aristotle remarks, how density and rarity, for instance, each retaining its essential nature, could in any way act upon each other. Consequently, he concludes, we must postulate the existence of a third something that is logically distinct from the pair of opposite qualities which successively inhere in it. Sometimes the third something has a name denoting a set of recognizable qualities other than the opposites in question. Thus, when hot soup cools, or when thin soup thickens, omitting all references to physical theories about heat and evaporation, which are known to the average person by hearsay, or at best by indirect experiment and ratiocination, we fall quite spontaneously into the triadic way of thinking. For the meaning of soup is familiar to us through other properties, and we can easily think of hot and cold, thin and thick, as qualities that are distinct from the soup itself. But there are other situations, other forms of experience, when there is no specific subject already within purview, and we have to invent one by a linguistic manner. Thus, when in ordinary conversation, someone remarks, "It was cool, but now it has become warm," what do we take the word "it" to refer to? If challenged on the point, a person might retort, "the weather." But obviously the new word tells nothing more than the word "it" had done. Neither it nor the weather gives us any knowledge that would not have already been contained in the Heraclitean statement, "cool has become warm," or "the cool has become the warm." The difference is not empirical, it is syntactical and epistemological. The preferred linguistic convention expresses a conceptual need. Most persons are uneasy in contemplating change in so radical a manner as Heraclitus does. They require, as a conceptual prop, the idea of something I know not what, underlying the changing particulars. In this respect, although perhaps without knowing it, they are Aristotelians. Heraclitus, on the contrary, is not an Aristotelian. Neither grammatically nor conceptually does he share Aristotle's need for a third something that endures in any alteration from opposite to opposite. To him, every change is a knockdown battle between two ontological opposites, and there is no referee, neither a Platonic higher form nor an Aristotelian underlying substance that can be regarded as standing logically outside the process. Even deity is no exception. Particular gods and demigods, although superior to men, are finite and will eventually be transformed from gods into something else. On the other hand, a divine name, when employed in a comprehensive and absolute sense, stands for the total self-organizing and self-destroying process itself. As when Heraclitus is said to declare, although we do not possess a direct quotation on this point, that war and Zeus are the same thing. Since conflict is the ultimate condition of everything, it alone merits the epithets of divinity. What is ultimate must be conceived as strife, war, and tension. Peace and stability are either strife in slow motion, or at most a temporary lull between one flare-up of strife and another. If strife is fundamental, then it follows that humanly significant results come about not from any planning, but by chance. Conditions may at one time be propitious to life, or even to the higher forms of life and thought. At another time they may be destructive and annihilating. When conscious life beholds a set of conditions that have been favorable to its development, it tends to regard such conditions as produced by a cosmic purpose that is somehow concerned with the welfare and destiny of such living forms as its own. Heraclitus rejects any such assumption as unwarranted. If we are going to employ a human analogy in speaking of the guiding of the universe as a whole, let us describe it not as a mature, wise, and kindly God, but rather as an irresponsible child idly moving counters in a game. But if chance is characteristic of universal process, what is to be made of the statement which Stobaeus ascribes to Heraclitus that all things occur as they are destined? To be sure, Dills omits the fragment from his list, but Bywater accepts it, and my point is that even if it is authentic, even if indeed the ensuing remark in Stobaeus that the destiny has the character of necessity is to be taken as part of the quotation from Heraclitus, still there is no real difficulty about reconciling it with the doctrine that things happen by chance. The ideas of chance and necessity are not mutually contradictory, but as Aristotle has shown, they represent the non-human aspect of things in two different perspectives. From the humanistic point of view, whatever lies outside the range of human planning can be said to happen by chance, so far as human purposes are concerned, and the Greeks expressed the unhumanistic nature of such events by applying to them the metallic word Anki, necessity. A necessary event is so described not because some cosmic tyrant pushes it into being, but precisely because no one does so. Therefore, from the standpoint of anyone whom it affects, the event may be described as fortuitous, accidental, something that has happened by chance. To say that the universe flows along as it is destined, or by necessity, and to say that the royal power is a child's, or that the counters are moved arbitrarily and by chance, are different ways of asserting that the major occurrences in the universe lie outside the range and power of any man or god. They run along by themselves as a result of many forces, which are most characteristically in conflict, but which sometimes enter into temporary and limited alliances and which somehow manage in their fluctuations to reveal glimpses of a subtle and larger hidden harmony. End quote. Okay, a couple important points here. Let me work backwards a little bit because I just feel like this is super important at the end when he talks about Anki. I'm really big on the idea of Anki, and I'll be talking more about Anki in the next episode as well when we talk about Parmenides. But I'm glad that this author brings it up. So Anki is an ancient Greek concept / goddess. Not one of the most prominent gods like Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, not one of the big 12, if you will, the main Greek deities. Anki is oftentimes just understood as a concept, just as the concept of necessity, and is sometimes made into a deity and sometimes not. Which, by the way, I think goes to reinforce the idea that the Greeks actually did understand their gods as, in a way, as metaphors. But what I like is how he's talking about from, there are different perspectives. So like there's the human perspective where things seem, and let me just reread exactly what he says. He says, from the standpoint of anyone whom it affects, the event may be described as fortuitous, accidental, something that has happened by chance. So from your perspective as a limited human being with, and this is something I've been talking about on this podcast for episodes and episodes now, and I'm really glad that he brings it up. But from your perspective, it looks like chaos. It looks random. It looks like, that the whole world is run by, a child just randomly moving things about, and it doesn't seem like there's always this order that's easily discernible. And yet, at the same time, everything is bound to a sort of necessity. Everything happens by order. He mentions at the very end a sort of hidden harmony. So there are kind of underlying rules by which this perpetual change occurs. It's not entirely just random, although it seems that way, but there's this concept, which I'll just go ahead and refer to as a goddess of Anki, of necessity, and also fate. Anki means necessity, but is understood as, the goddess of necessity, but also a goddess of fate. And so with those two things combined, I kind of see Anki as like that which must be, that which must occur, which occurs by necessity. So fate and necessity. So I like that idea that there's almost like an underlying order to everything. But that doesn't negate the perpetual change. It doesn't negate the multiplicity of things. And he goes into that in more detail later on when he talks a little bit more about Anki and the hidden harmony. And he says like this doesn't undo the basic premise of Heraclitus that everything is at strife with everything else and constantly changing and fluctuating. Although it does kind of postulate perhaps something at the core that is more structured. So anyway, let me jump to the next section. This part's not very long, but he talks about fire a little bit, and I just wanted to touch on that because Heraclitus is so often associated with the idea of fire. And so I just wanted to read a little bit of this. He says, Heraclitus's principle of a continually changing universe, what Spengler calls the first formulation of his theory, is symbolized not only by such diverse figures as the flowing river and the child idly moving counters in a game, but also, and most centrally, by fire. Fire is the most significant of the several symbols by which the Heraclitean idea of change is expressed. First, because it has not just one basis of symbolic connection with the central idea, but at least three. And secondly, because Heraclitus regards fire as playing not only a symbolic, but also a literal role of importance in his doctrine of the cosmos. The three main properties of fire that give it so important a symbolic role are its light and brightness, its warmth and consequent ability to effect changes, such as in cooking, and its unique agility and power of rapid self-increase. The clear glow of wisdom, in which outlines and distinctions are made visible, the enthusiasm and urgency to create, and the quickness and alertness of mind and spirit, which these properties respectively tend to symbolize, are what have given to fire, in its broadest sense, including the sun and the sparkle of daylight in the upper air, its perennial symbolic importance. These meanings are present in Heraclitus's thinking too, but as is quite generally the case with ancient thinkers, he did not distinguish between vehicle and tenor sharply, and it is evident that he thinks of fire not only as meaning something other than itself, but also as a physical thing, albeit a fast-moving and elusive thing, playing a definite role in the natural world. So I'm not going to talk about that an awful lot, just that he represents fire in multiple ways. He says fire's symbolic of the nature of the perpetual change of things. Also, fire plays a role in his cosmology, because he does, like Heraclitus does, sort of draw out a quasi-cosmology of the nature of the way the world works, above and beyond just the idea of perpetual change. But he kind of does describe a structure of like fire moving upward and things moving downward. He sees how fire moves up towards the sky, and so like the proper place of fire is upward, and there's a sort of an upward path, and then there's a downward path of rain falling, and that upward and downward path like has a lot to do with Heraclitus's vision of reality. So anyway, let me get on to the last section here, which I think is pretty cool and pretty important. You probably guessed this podcast probably not going to be one of my longest episodes, which is fine. All right, so let me jump into the last part I want to read, where he's talking more about the hidden harmony and more about what I would identify as an Anki. He says, "So closely has Heraclitus' name been associated in Western philosophical tradition with the related themes of change and paradox that there has often been a tendency to overlook the peculiar emphasis which he gives to the unity, in a qualified and paradoxical sense, of all things. Writers on ancient philosophy have sometimes been tempted to schematize their material by contrasting Parmenides and Heraclitus as representing extreme opposite tendencies, thereby producing a vast philosophical conundrum which the so-called later naturalists, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Leucippus, and Democritus, undertook to solve by their diversely ingenious types of metaphysical integration. Of course, there is a large half-truth in this way of envisaging the matter, for it cannot be denied that Parmenides is, above all else, the philosopher of unity and permanence, who regards every apparent evidence of variety or change as ipso facto illusory. Nor can it be denied that Heraclitus accepts variety and change as basic and inexpugnable facts about the real nature of things. Unquestionably, the opposition between the philosophers is there for all to see. Nevertheless, the resulting stereotype, which represents them as doctrinally contrasted and nothing more, can be grossly overdone. Relatively few qualifications need to be made for Parmenides, no doubt, but the philosophy of Heraclitus is too subtle, manifold, and shifting to be defined in such static terms. Granted that variety and change constitute a main theme, perhaps even the main theme for Heraclitus, there is nevertheless a second theme, running contrapuntally throughout the doctrine, which is equally indispensable. The theme expressed most plainly in fragment 118, that all things are one. It is misleading to call Heraclitus a pluralist without adding that he is somehow a monist as well, or to stress that his doctrine of change, chance, and strife, without adding that these characteristics, real and basic though they are, exist somehow counterbalanced by a tendency toward order, pattern, and harmony, which is equally inherent in what we must call, knowing that words fail us here, reality. Still, the mode of balancing requires careful attention and careful statement. The peculiar sense in which Heraclitus accepts cosmic oneness as a reality cannot be indicated by any of the usual philosophical labels. Even so learned a Heraclitean scholar as Hermann Diels made the mistake, some 15 years after compiling his valuable collection of the fragments, of putting forward an interpretation of Heraclitus as a metaphysical dualist. In his article on the philosopher, in Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, Diels espouses a distinction between what he calls the husk and kernel of Heraclitus' doctrine, the former term referring to the fiery world of change, the latter to the ultimate oneness of the Logos. He even goes so far as to support his quasi-Platonic interpretation by some apparently biased translation. For example, fragment 120 ends with the phrase Ponta dia Pontaun, which characterizes the cosmic intelligence as steering all things through all things, an idea of typical Heraclitean complexity. Diels, however, changes his translation in the encyclopedia article to read, which knows and governs all things. Now there is a good deal of connotative difference between this phrase and the one that Heraclitus uses, and the difference becomes even more significant when it is realized that the verb which I have translated are steered, to avoid an excessive suggestion of individual liberty, might equally well, or almost equally well, be translated steer themselves. For the difference between the Greek passive and the Greek middle voice is not grammatically indicated in certain tenses, and a number of Heraclitus's phrases suggest an inseparable coalescence of the two kinds of idea. The intelligence, which is also to say the thunderbolt that does the steering, operates on particular things, including human individuals, from within as well as from without. And the result, as several earlier chapters have shown in different perspectives, is a universe in which unity, diversity, self-direction, chance, and ambiguity all commingle. But Diels' mistranslation enables him to reach the strange and unacceptable conclusion that Heraclitus comprehends, exactly as his opponent Parmenides, who only partly understood him, noumena and phenomena, truth and illusion, in his system. It is one thing to compare, another to equalize such diverse thinkers as Heraclitus and Parmenides. The kinds of cosmic unity for which they respectively stand are radically different. Diels' dualistic interpretation of Heraclitus causes him to belittle such fragments as Fragment 24, time is a child moving counters in a game, and Fragment 40, the fairest universe is but a heap of rubbish piled up at random, as referring only to ephemeral experience, which he thinks represents to Heraclitus the mutable, inconsistent, unconscious, and childish world of change. But to Heraclitus' notion, all experience is ephemeral, and all things are mutable and partly or potentially inconsistent. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The unity of things as Heraclitus understands it is a subtle and hidden sort of unity, not at all as such as could be expressed by either a monistic or dualistic philosophy. The oneness of things, or rather their mutual attunement, cannot exist or even be conceived apart from their manyness and discord. The wisdom that steers all things through all things," overtone, the wisdom by which all things steer themselves through all things, is something that cannot be expressed without paradox. To call it God or Zeus is at once necessary and belittling. It is necessary because there is no way in which to refer or think about the ultimate cosmological problem of the relatedness of all things, except by employing the least inadequate symbols that we possess. On the other hand, any divine name is misleading because of the doctrinal and mythological associations that it almost invariably conjures up in people's minds. No attempt to characterize the ultimate unity of things, or the power and tendency toward unity, can possibly succeed, and yet man's inquiring mind cannot permanently abandon the attempt. End quote. Okay, so he's talking, this whole chapter is called The Hidden Harmony, and he's talking about the idea that in some of Heraclitus's fragments, he makes it sound as though, what all things are one. There's one fragment where he says all things are one, which is, taken as really like making him a monist. But, that's just one line, and his statements that sound along those lines, they're not really the primary focus of what he's writing. And he's also saying that, like, the oneness of things is only really comprehensible when built upon the many. To say that all things are one begins from a position of all things. Without that, there's only just one is one. All is all. And I think that, he talks about this fellow Diels, who's a scholar of ancient Greece and a scholar of Heraclitus, and how Diels radically misunderstands Heraclitus by presenting him as a sort of dualist, and moreover presenting the idea that Well, the world of many things is sort of an illusion. And, he says it's the husk and the kernel, but the husk he presented as an illusion. You see, there's this sort of constant push among scholars and among common people, and I talked about this in not the last episode, but the previous one about pantheism. There's like this constant push that the idea that like wisdom itself and kind of like profound wisdom and truth must be sort of tied to this idea that all things are one. And when you look at the traditions of the Far East, or maybe especially of India, or other esoteric ideas, you constantly run up, and even in Plato, you run up against this idea that like the many things of the world with which you interact is sort of an illusion, and that the reality is the oneness that's underneath or hidden behind all of the many things. And despite the fact that Heraclitus never makes any sort of claim that the world of constant flux is somehow an illusion or less real than the hidden harmony, which is like the truth, or even more than the harmony, like the oneness of all things, the interrelatedness of all things, and oneness and connection of all things, etc. That's the real truth. And the separation of things, and the strife between things, and the changing of things, all that is illusion. Heraclitus does not say that. Parmenides says that, or something very much along those lines. Heraclitus does not. So Heraclitus is really saying that there is both, and I think in some sense he might kind of do Diels dirty here. He really attacks Diels' interpretation. I think Diels is off to an extent, but I also think Diels kind of sees that, yeah, okay, so Heraclitus' idea of hidden harmony has to be kind of understood as a kernel, in the sense that it's an inner thing that's not readily apparent, and the husk, which is outside, is the thing that is more readily apparent. But the husk isn't an illusion, it's just the readily apparent part, and then you have to kind of dig into it a little bit to get to the hidden part of it. I think that that's like what reality is like. When you look around you, you see all of the many things, and you see all of the change, and you experience all of the change, and it's not hard to understand that even things which are generally consistent, it doesn't take an awful lot of consideration to realize that they're also changing. They're also, subject to the wear and tear of reality. The table gets marks on it. The table gets spills on it. It gets older, and it gets bit by bit. It's aging. It's decaying. Things change and decay in that way. And that's not hard to recognize through basic observation. Whereas this like deep, you might say, okay, well, there are relations between things, the cup is sitting on the table, the cup and the table have a relationship, but it's a whole other thing to say that all things are related, or even that all things are related equally. There's an equality between the relations of all things, and that this relation is between all things is the truth, and that relation of all things inherently points toward a unity of all things and a oneness of all things that manifests in this harmony. And the more the closer you get to that oneness, the closer you're getting to wisdom. And so that if you think that an ancient Greek philosopher is a wise man, and you want to attribute to him wisdom, you're almost obligated to interpret him in that way. You're almost obligated to say, this thinker believes that at the base of reality, everything is one, and all of the various conflicts between people, the ups and downs of life, the physical form that you take, basically everything you see when you open your eyes is all a sort of lesser illusion, or in some way derivative of this inner oneness and harmony. And that idea that wisdom and oneness, or the recognition of oneness, are so bound together, it becomes very difficult for people, I think, to make the case that actually the wisdom of Heraclitus comes from his acknowledgement of the blatant, manifest, multitudinous world of things and strife, and the pervasiveness of all of that, and that we're bound up in a world of change, and we will never escape the world of things. We will never transcend the world of things. And to think that we can escape from the world of things into this like nirvana of oneness is just delusion. And Heraclitus recognizes that, like, you're bound in it. You know, the idea of paradox or difference, that everything is different from different perspectives. So it's not that any of it is an illusion. It's just that it's only a half truth. Like when he talks about, I think he says something along the lines of, and I'm probably getting this wrong, but something along the lines of, you know, a man prefers gold to oats, but a donkey would prefer oats to gold. And so you might say from that, well, gold, you know, if you say, oh, gold has this value, but gold doesn't really have that value inherently. It only has that value to us. If you stand in the position of a donkey, gold doesn't really have that value. So the value isn't inherent in the thing. It's in how you see it. And so you might look at that and say, well, okay, so then the value of gold is therefore an illusion. You know, that sort of paradoxical way of looking at things, it can potentially be used to dismantle our understanding. But I'm not sure that I would really go that far or take that sort of understanding. I guess the conclusion I want to draw here is that we have to step out of the dedication to oneness, unity, relation, cooperation. Like in the episode about pantheism, I was talking about the same thing. It's a pervasive idea, but it's not really accurate. The world is many things. It will always be many things. It will always be shifting. It will always be changing. We will never be able to step in the same river twice. You know, like Heraclitus is right. He's right about a lot of these things. He's also right about the hidden harmony, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Parmenides. But the multitudinous nature of reality is not something that can be ignored. It's not something that can be dismissed as illusion. And it's not something that should be kind of a secondary to oneness. It's fun. The variety, the flux, if you will, is just fundamental. I don't think there's anything exactly else that I wanted to talk about other than, I guess, just to say that, as Nietzsche had sort of pointed out, Heraclitus sees this, he almost sees this one thing of perpetual change, right? If you're talking about perpetual change, well, the change itself is perpetual and therefore doesn't change, right? The change is constant. And in that sense, I think he sets up almost two tiers of divinity, if you will. So he says that kind of like the gods themselves even will come and go. Even the gods themselves are not eternal, but are subject to the comings and goings of things. And yet there's also something which is divine, which is permanent, which is change. So there's sort of an interesting way of saying that. I don't know if Heraclitus would truly say that everything changes, because I don't think Heraclitus would say that change changes, that change itself is perpetual. And so there has to be some sort of like deeper restrictions on the perpetual change. You know, there's a deeper level whereby you must acknowledge, well, okay, the change itself continues. And the fact that the change itself is perpetual could be considered a law. And so on a deeper level, there could be considered perpetual permanent laws. And recognizing that sort of surface level and deeper level is good and doesn't necessarily need to be interpreted in the sense that, well, the shallower, if you will, world of multitudinous things is an illusion. It's not an illusion. It's not an illusion, and it's not something that's like morally wrong, where separation, strife, and conflict are morally wrong, and cooperation and unity and oneness and everything are morally right. We fall into that a lot as well, and it maybe comes from that perspective a little bit as well, that in order to justify Heraclitus as a moral person that we ought to study and incorporate into our lives, we have to, before we can do that, step away from the idea that war is the father of all things. Strife is the father of all things. Like we feel morally wrong to embrace this idea that strife, conflict, war, struggle, birth, death, impermanence, the perpetual coming and going of things, like there's got to be some sort of immorality in that. I think that's how we look at things. If we want to be moral people, we have to plug into this deeper connection. That's how many people view morality. It makes it difficult to study someone like Heraclitus and acknowledge, like, well, is strife and conflict really the source of all things? That is very different. That says kind of like the one thing that continues on, the one thing that is true and perpetual is strife and conflict, and that war and Zeus are the same thing. It's a hard pill for many people to swallow, and it's especially hard pill for people on the left to swallow, to take a dip into the politics a little bit. Very difficult for people who take a generally leftist perspective to accept this perpetual strife and conflict. Seems like it seems like everything is always on the left is always driven toward this drive toward unity. So that's all I'm going to talk about Heraclitus now. Just that I think that hidden harmony of Anki is something important, but can't be overblown. And with that, I'm going to wind this episode down, and I hope you tune in next time for the next episode, when we will continue talking about some of these pre-Socratic philosophers. Thanks a lot. See you later.